When they cut the jacket off him in the aisle of that bus, a passenger screamed, not because of the blood, because of what was stitched on the back. 41 people watched a bus driver put his hands on the chest of a man wearing a death's head patch and start counting compressions out loud. Some of them begged him to stop. One of them filmed it. That video is why he lost everything. And it's also why, 4 months later, the sound of 500 engines shook the windows of a town that had already decided he was finished. Before I take you out onto that road, I want to know who's riding with me tonight. Because this is an hour. It's a long one, and it's a hard one in places. And the people who make it all the way to the end of a story like this are a certain kind of person. So do me one favor before we go. Tell me where you're watching from. Just drop it in the comments. Your town, your state, your country. Ohio, Alberta, Kentucky. Wherever you are, whatever time it is where you're sitting right now, put it down there. Because I want to see, by the end of tonight, how many of us there were. And while you're down there, hit subscribe. Not for me. Do it because the woman who stood up on that bus and said put him back outside, she's not subscribing. The man with the clipboard who signed that termination letter, he isn't either. Their kind never do. They watch, and they scroll, and they leave nothing behind, and they go back to being exactly who they are. You're not them. You wouldn't be here if you were. So take 30 seconds. Comment where you're from. Hit subscribe, and then put the phone down, turn the lights off, and come with me. Because on the 3rd of March, in a blizzard on a closed highway, a 58-year-old bus driver named Wendell Okonkwo-Bright made a decision that took him 11 seconds. It cost him 31 years. And it started, the way these things always start, with a road, and a storm, and a man just trying to get 41 people home. The snow did not fall that night so much as it arrived. Sideways, in sheets, driven off the open fields on the west side of the highway by a wind that had come down out of Canada and found nothing in its way for 400 miles. By 7 o'clock, the plows had given up on the shoulders and were fighting just to keep one lane open, and the salt trucks were behind schedule, and the state radio was telling people what state radio always tells people in a storm like that, which is to stay home. Most of them did. Most of them looked out a kitchen window at a world going white and decided that whatever waited for them out there could wait until morning. Route 40 does not care about mornings. Route 40 is a working road. It runs east out of the city, past the tire plant, and the rail yard, and the long gray rows of warehouses, and it carries the people who cannot stay home. The second shift, the third shift, the ones who clock in when everyone else is turning on a television. And every weeknight at 6:40, the same bus pulled out of the Northern Line depot to run that loop. And behind the wheel of that bus was the same man who had been behind the wheel of that bus for longer than some of his passengers had been alive. His name was Wendell Okonkwo-Bright. He was 58 years old. He had driven for Northern Line Transit for 31 years. And in those 31 years, he had never been in an accident, never received a citation, never been the subject of a passenger complaint. And, this is the part the people at the depot always laughed about, the part that had become a kind of joke that wasn't really a joke. Never once been late. Not once. Not in a heat wave, not in a flood, not on the morning his wife was buried. There was a man in the dispatch office who used to say, "You could set your watch by Wendell," and the strange thing is that people actually did. That was the whole of him, as far as the company was concerned. A record. A clean, unbroken, 31-year record. But Wendell had a rule of his own, one he had never told anyone at Northern Line, because in 31 years he had broken his employer's rules exactly once. And we will come back to that, because it explains everything about what he did on Route 40. To understand a man like that, you have to understand what he goes home to. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright lived alone. He had not always. For 26 years, he had lived with a woman named Patrice, and if you had asked anyone at the depot to describe her, they would have started with her laugh, because you heard it before you saw her. She used to come by on Fridays with a tin of something, and it would be halfway across the lot before she was. She died 4 years before that storm. It was fast, as those things go, and it was not fair, as those things never are. And Wendell took 3 days and came back to work on the 4th, and drove his route, and was on time. Here is the thing about a marriage of 26 years. It does not live in the big moments. It lives in the small mechanical habits of a body that has stopped noticing it has them. Every night before bed, Patrice made 2 sandwiches, one for her lunch, one for his, and wrapped them and put them in the refrigerator side by side. After she was gone, Wendell kept making them. Both of them. He would stand at the counter at 11 o'clock at night and make 2 sandwiches, and in the morning, he would take one to work, and in the evening, he would come home and open the refrigerator and see the other one sitting there, and he would throw it away. He did that for 4 years. He knew he was doing it. He simply could not find a reason to stop. He drove the 640 loop because he wanted it. Younger drivers avoided it. It was the graveyard commute, the long dark run with the thin crowds and the late return. But Wendell had asked for it, and kept asking for it, because it was quiet, and because a quiet bus is a kind of company that does not require anything of you. 22 people spread over 40 seats, all of them tired, none of them talking. The heater ticking, the wipers keeping time. There are worse ways to spend an evening than driving slowly through a city that has stopped asking you questions. And every driver at that depot knew one thing about him, and it was not the record. It was the waiting. If you came running for Wendell's bus was there. 15 seconds. He gave you 15 seconds. Every time. And he did it whether you were a woman in heels with a briefcase, or a kid with a backpack, or an old man 3/4 of a block away, who was never going to make it, and made it anyway. Other drivers pulled out. Wendell held. 15 seconds. And then the doors would open, and he would not say anything about it, and you would sit down out of breath, and the bus would go. He kept it. Somehow, through everything, he kept his time. And the last thing, the only thing, really, that he still had, a house on Marrow Street. Small, white, a porch that needed painting. He and Patrice bought it young, and spent 20 years paying it down, and made the final payment in 2019, together, at a kitchen table, with a checkbook. It was the last thing they ever built, and it was paid for. March 3rd began as an ordinary Tuesday. Cold, gray, unremarkable. The kind of day nobody writes down. The advisory came in at 4:15. Not a warning, an advisory, which is the language the weather service uses when it wants you to understand that something is coming without telling you what to do about it. Heavy snow after 6. Winds out of the northwest at 30, gusting higher. Visibility falling. Travel discouraged. Every transit system in the country has a procedure for that. Somebody has to make a call. And at the Northern Line depot, the man who made that call was a supervisor named Calvin Strawbridge. I want to be careful here, because it would be very easy at this point to tell you what kind of man Calvin Strawbridge was, and I am not going to do that yet. All I will tell you is what he did, which is that he looked at the advisory, and he looked at the schedule, and he made the decision that depots make 99 times out of 100, and are right about 98 of them. He ran the routes, the buses went out, and so at 6:40 in the evening, Wendell Okonkwo-Bright pulled out of the yard with the snow already coming down hard enough that he had the wipers on their middle setting before he reached the first light. 41 people got on that bus. I have the manifest counts. I do not have all the names, and the ones I have, I am not going to use, because most of them never asked to be part of this. But I can tell you who was on there, in the broad strokes, because it matters to what comes next. There was a woman near the front with a newborn. The child could not have been more than a few weeks old, and she had it wrapped against her chest under her coat. There was a man in scrubs, 3 rows back, coming off a double shift, asleep sitting up before they cleared the second stop. There were 3 teenagers in the back doing what teenagers do on a bus, which is take up more space than they need, and laugh too loudly. And there was an elderly couple, midway down on the right, holding hands on the armrest between them, the way people do after 50 years, without noticing they are doing it. 41 people, ordinary people, going home. By the time the bus reached the long open stretch east of the tire plant, where the fields fall away on both sides, and there is nothing to break the wind for miles, the snow had stopped being weather and had started being a wall. Visibility collapsed. 20 feet. Wendell later said he could see the front of his own bus and almost nothing beyond it. He dropped to 15 miles an hour. He put his hazards on. He drove by memory, because he had driven that road 10,000 times and he knew where the crown of it was under his tires. And then the radio came up. Static. That hard, chewed static you get when the air itself is full of snow. And then a dispatcher's voice, thin and far away, saying that Route 40 was closed at mile 62, and Wendell keyed the mic, and in the same flat, unhurried voice he had used for 31 years, he said, "Copy. 41 on board." Proceeding to the depot. Somewhere past mile 61, in the worst of it, his headlights caught something off the right shoulder. It was not much. A shape. A dark irregularity in a world that had gone completely white, down in the ditch where the snow had drifted deep against the fence line. It was there in the wash of his high beams for perhaps a second and a half, and then it was behind him, and then it was gone. And Wendell Okonkwo-Bright kept driving. I want you to sit with that, because it is the truest thing in this entire story. He did not stop. He did not slam the brakes and leap heroically into the storm. He was a 58-year-old man with 41 people behind him on a road that had just been declared closed, and his hands were on the wheel, and he had seen something that was probably nothing. A tarp, a bag, a piece of fence, a black plastic drum blown out of somebody's yard, and he did what almost every human being on this earth would have done. He kept going. 300 yards. That is how far he got. 300 yards of Route 40 in 15-mile-an-hour visibility, which takes about 40 seconds, and in those 40 seconds, something happened inside that man that he was never fully able to explain to me. He stopped the bus. Not on the shoulder, there was no shoulder anymore, there was only snow, but in the middle of the eastbound lane, on a closed highway, in the dark. And he sat there. The passengers behind him looked up. The wipers kept going. The heater ticked. 11 seconds. He sat there for 11 seconds. And then he put his hand on the shifter, and he did the single thing that a transit driver is never, under any circumstances, permitted to do. He reversed a 40-foot public bus, in a blizzard, on a live road, with 41 people aboard. He did not know if the shape in that ditch was a person or a piece of tarp. He did not know if he was about to walk down into the snow and look at a corpse. He did not know anything at all. What he did know, what he told me, years later, sitting in a kitchen with no furniture left in it, was this. If I drove home and I was wrong, I'd have to live in that house with it. So he opened the door, and he stepped out into the snow. The wind took the door out of his hand. He went down the embankment on his heels, sideways, the way you do when the snow is deeper than your boots, and there is nothing under it you can trust. And the first thing he found was not the shape at all. It was the motorcycle, 60 feet off the road, thrown clear into the field, lying on its side with the snow already burying the low half of it, and the engine was still ticking as it cooled. That is the detail Wendell could never get out of his head. That small, patient metal sound, going tick, 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 in the middle of all that howling nothing. It meant minutes. It meant this had just happened. And then he found the man. He was face down in the drift, against the fence line, and he was enormous, 6'3", 250 pounds, and every ounce of it soaked through and freezing and gone completely limp. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright is 5'9". He was 58 years old. He had a bad shoulder from a fall off a loading dock in 1996. There was no one else. There was not going to be anyone else. The road was closed. So he got his hands under the man's arms, and he pulled. 40 feet. That was the distance from where the man lay to the open door of that bus. 40 feet. The length of the bus itself. It took Wendell 9 minutes. 9 minutes of hauling a deadweight uphill through snow past his knees, 6 inches at a time, falling twice, getting up twice, in a wind that was taking the heat out of him faster than his body could make it. He said afterward that he stopped counting how many times he thought he could not do it, because the number stopped being useful. But he got him to the door, and hands came down out of the light to help. The passengers took the man's weight and got him up the steps, and laid him out flat in the aisle, and somebody knelt down and pulled off the heavy wet outer jacket to check him for bleeding. And that is the exact moment, 7:52 in the evening, on the 3rd of March, when the mood inside that bus changed completely, because when they turned him over, they saw what was stitched onto the back, and a woman near the front stood up and said the sentence that would end Wendell Okonkwo-Bright's career. Put him back outside, stop the tape right there, with that sentence hanging in the air of a bus, in the middle of a blizzard. 41 people were on board, and I want you to hold on to something, because it matters more than anything else I am going to tell you tonight. Not one of them knew that man's name, not one of them had asked, not one of them had checked his wallet, or looked for a phone, or leaned down close enough to hear whether he was still breathing. They had been on that bus for 4 seconds with him. 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, they saw a patch on a piece of leather, and they decided that a human being, lying unconscious in the aisle of their bus, was not worth the trouble. That is not a hard thing to do. That is the easiest thing in the world to do. It is what most people do, most of the time, and they go home and they sleep fine. So, let me ask you something. Right now, before we go any further, if you believe that a man deserves to be pulled out of a snowbank, whether or not you like what he is wearing, hit subscribe. Do it now. Because I promise you, the people who wanted him left in that ditch are not going to. They never do. They never have. And leave me one thing in the comments. 3 words. Pull him in. Just so I know which side of that aisle you would have been standing on. Because 41 people had to choose that night. And you should know that of the 41, only 2 of them got down on the floor. The man on the floor of that bus had a name, though nobody on board would learn it for another 19 days. His name was Russo Vanterpool. Everyone who knew him called him Dutch. He was 54 years old. At the moment the doors closed behind him, Russo Vanterpool had a collapsed lung, a fractured femur, and a core body temperature that was falling through the range where a human being simply stops working. He was not dying in the way people die in films, with words and a hand reaching up. He was dying the way people actually die in the cold, quietly, without drama, becoming a little less present every minute while everyone stands around arguing. And they did argue. Wendell knelt down in the aisle beside him, and the woman near the front said it again. Put him back outside. And a man 3 rows behind her agreed with her, loudly, and said what everyone in that bus was thinking, which is that this was not their problem, that the roads were closed, that they had children at home, that the driver had a job to do, and the job was to drive. Wendell did not answer them. Wendell put 2 fingers against the man's throat and found nothing, and then a voice came from 3 rows back, and it was the man in the scrubs, the one who had been asleep sitting up since the second stop, who had just come off a 16-hour shift and had nothing left in him at all. He came up the aisle, and he got down on the floor on the other side of that body, and he said 4 words. I'm a nurse. Move. 2 men. Out of 41. They started compressions. Now, I need to stop, and I need to tell you what was actually happening inside Russo Vanterpool while those 2 men worked, because if I don't, you will hear the rest of this, and you will not understand that you are listening to something that should not have been possible. When the human body gets cold, really cold, the kind of cold where the core drops below 85 degrees, it begins shutting down in a specific order. First, the shivering stops, and people think that means it is getting better, and it means the opposite. It means the body has run out of fuel to burn. Then the blood thickens. Then the heart begins to fibrillate, to quiver instead of beat. And at that point, the heart is not a pump anymore. It is a bag of muscle twitching in a chest. Below a certain temperature, a defibrillator will not restart it. Drugs will not restart it. There is nothing that will restart it except heat, and heat takes time, and the body has none. That is what a collapsed lung and a fractured femur and 90 minutes in a snowdrift do to a man. Emergency medicine has a phrase for people in that condition. They say a person is not dead until they are warm and dead. It sounds like hope. What it really means is that there is almost nothing anyone can do in the field except keep the blood moving and pray for an ambulance. There was no ambulance. The call went out. Wendell keyed the mic and gave his position, and the dispatcher relayed it, and somewhere a rig rolled out. And it got 4 miles and stopped, because Route 40 was closed at mile 62, and a jackknife truck had taken the westbound lane, and the plows were behind, and nothing on 4 wheels was reaching that bus for an hour and a half. An hour and a half. So a 58-year-old bus driver and an exhausted nurse knelt on a rubber floor mat in a freezing bus and kept a man's blood moving with their hands. Wendell did CPR twice. The first time was short. The second time he did 6 straight minutes without stopping. 6 minutes. Which, if you have never done chest compressions, I want you to understand, is an eternity. It is a full-body exertion that destroys your shoulders and your back and your will inside of 90 seconds. And he was 58 years old and had just dragged this man 40 feet through snow, and his hands were still numb from doing it. And behind him, in the seats, the woman near the front took out her phone. She was not calling 911. That call had already been made. She dialed the number on the placard above the windshield, the Northern Line customer complaint line, the one nobody ever calls, and she left a message. And then she turned the phone around, and she held it up, and she began to film. They worked for 93 minutes, and at 9:12 that night, on the floor of a city bus in the middle of a blizzard on a closed highway, Russo Vanterpool's pulse came back. Wendell sat back on his heels. He said he did not feel joy. He said he did not feel anything except tired. And 31 seconds later, it stopped again. 2 days later, the storm was gone. The plows had come through, the salt had done its work, and Route 40 was just a road again. Wet, gray, ordinary, the snow shoved into brown ridges along the fence line, where nobody would look twice at it. That is how fast a night like that disappears from the world. 48 hours. But it had not disappeared. It had only moved. On the 5th of March, the woman near the front of the bus uploaded her video. 31 seconds. That was all of it. 31 seconds, shot vertically, shaky, over the seat back, with the interior lights of a transit bus washing everything out. And what it showed, what anyone scrolling past it at a red light or in a waiting room or in bed at 11 at night would have seen in the 2 seconds before they decided how they felt about it, was this: a city bus, full of passengers, some of them standing, some of them clearly upset, one of them with a hand over her mouth. And down on the floor, in the aisle, a driver in a Northern Line uniform, kneeling over the body of an enormous man in a leather cut, and stitched across the back of that leather, unmistakable even in a phone video, even at that resolution, the death's head. That is all it was. There was no sound of an ambulance that could not come. There was no nurse in scrubs. He was crouched below the frame. There was no motorcycle in a field with the engine still ticking. There was no 93 minutes. There was a bus, and a patch, and 41 frightened faces, and a man in a company uniform, with his hands on the chest of a Hell's Angel. 31 seconds, and none of them contained the truth. The first person at Northern Line Transit to see that video was a depot supervisor named Calvin Strawbridge. Now, I told you earlier that I was not going to tell you what kind of man Calvin Strawbridge was, and that I would only tell you what he did. I am going to keep that promise. But I am going to add one fact, and I am going to add it now, and then I am going to let you sit with it for the rest of this story. For 2 years, Calvin Strawbridge had been trying to get the 640 Route 40 loop reassigned. Not because it was a good route. It was not a good route. It was the graveyard commute, the long, dark run nobody wanted. But it was a senior route, and in a union shop with a defined benefit pension, a senior route is not a route. It is a ladder. It is the anchor a career gets tied to. And Calvin Strawbridge had a nephew, 26 years old, 3 years in, who had come to him twice about moving up. And sitting on that route, immovable, unbudgeable, blameless, 31 years, no accidents, no complaints, never once late, was Wendell Okonkwo-Bright. So Calvin Strawbridge watched 31 seconds of a video of his best driver saving a man's life. And Calvin Strawbridge did not pick up the phone and call him. He did not call the nurse whose name was right there on the incident report. He did not call the hospital. He did not call dispatch and pull the audio of a man's voice saying copy, 41 on board. He forwarded it upward, to legal, to operations, and he attached a note, and the note was 8 words long. Liability exposure. Recommend review. 8 words. He wrote them 11 minutes after he opened the file. And here is where you need to remember something I told you at the very beginning of this story. Section 12, subsection C of the Northern Line Transit Operator's Handbook. The rule that says a driver does not stop, does not deviate, does not open the doors for anything on that road that is not a scheduled passenger. The rule that was written by lawyers, for lawyers, to protect a company from being sued. There it was. The rule that existed to protect the company, being used, for the first time in its history, to destroy a man for saving a life. What happens next does not happen quickly. That is the cruelty of it. A man's life does not collapse in an afternoon. It closes, one door at a time, over months, with a letterhead on every one of them. The 19th of March. 16 days after the storm. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright was called into a room at the depot he had walked past 10,000 times, and he was handed a single page. And the page said that his employment with Northern Line Transit was terminated, effective immediately, for cause. The cause was printed on the 3rd line. Unauthorized deviation from assigned route and endangerment of passengers. He read it twice. He asked one question. He asked whether anybody had listened to the dispatch audio. The man across the table said the matter had been reviewed. He was asked to surrender his badge, his keys, and his uniform. Now, I need you to understand what those 4 words mean, terminated for cause. Because most people have never had to know, and Wendell Okonkwo-Bright did not know either. Not really. Not until he sat down 4 days later with a union representative and had it explained to him slowly, the way you explain a diagnosis. Terminated for cause means the pension does not vest out. It means the 31 years do not follow you to the door. It means every deduction from every paycheck across 3 decades, the money he and Patrice had budgeted around, planned around, said will be all right, because of the pension, is administratively severed from the man who earned it. 31 years, gone, on one page. In one afternoon, in April, the health insurance ended. He got a letter about that too. In May, the property tax bill came due on the house on Marrow Street. And here is something that people who have never been poor do not know, and that people who have been poor never forget. A paid-off house is not a safe house. There is no such thing as a house that cannot be taken. You can spend 20 years of your life sending checks to a bank, and make your last payment at a kitchen table with your wife beside you, and hold the deed in your hand. And if you cannot pay the county will take it anyway. Ownership is not shelter. Ownership is just a lower rent. He could not pay it. He had no income, no pension, and no insurance, and he was 58 years old, and his only professional qualification in this world was a commercial license attached to a termination for endangering passengers. He went back to the union. He asked them to fight, and the union representative, and I want to be fair to this man, because he was not a villain, he was simply tired, and he had seen this go one way 100 times, the union representative told him the truth. He told him that the video had 400,000 views. He told him that no arbitrator in the state was going to reinstate a driver whose worst moment was already on a screen in every one of their homes. He told him it was unwinnable, and then he said the sentence that Wendell said he could not stop hearing, months later, in the middle of the night. You should have just driven. On the 2nd of June, a real estate agent hammered a sign into the front yard of the house on Marrow Street. The porch still needed painting. Wendell watched from the window, and then he went and sat in the kitchen, where he had made 2 sandwiches every night for 4 years. And through all of it, every hearing, every letter, every closed and quietly locked door, there was one question sitting in the middle of Wendell Okonkwo-Bright's life. Like a stone he could not move. He never once asked it out loud. Not to the union, not to the lawyer he could not afford. Not to anyone, but he thought it every single night. In that emptying house. Did the man live? Nobody would tell him. The hospital would not confirm a patient. Northern Line's separation agreement forbade him from contacting anyone connected to the incident. 4 months. And for 4 months, Wendell Okonkwo-Bright genuinely did not know whether he had thrown away his entire life for a corpse. There is one more detail about that termination letter, and I have been holding it. Calvin Strawbridge signed it with a pen he kept in a mug on his desk. The mug said "World's Okayest Boss." It had been a gift from somebody in the office, and he thought it was funny, and he kept it right there next to the phone. And that is the pen he picked up to end 31 years of a man's working life. And 11 days after Wendell Okonkwo-Bright handed in his badge, the 640 Route 40 loop, the senior route, the pension route, the one Calvin had been trying to shake loose for 2 years, was reassigned. If you have ever in your life watched a small man with a clipboard take apart a good man with a conscience, if you have watched it happen at your job, or to your father, or to you, and you are sick of it, then like this video. Not for me. I don't need it. Do it because somewhere out there, right now, there is a Calvin Strawbridge writing 8 words on an email he has not thought about for more than 11 minutes. And every single like on this video is a vote that says his kind does not get to keep winning quietly. And leave 2 words in the comments for the man who is about to lose his house. 31 years. Comment it if you believe that a pension a man spent his entire life earning should not be erased as punishment for the crime of being decent. Because here is what nobody at Northern Line Transit knew yet. Somebody had been looking for Wendell since the day he woke up. He lived. Russo Vanterpool lived. He came off that bus with a pulse, and they warmed him, and they reinflated a lung, and they put a rod through a shattered femur, and then he went down into the dark and he stayed there for 19 days. 19 days in a coma. His daughter sat in that room. His club sat in the parking lot, in shifts, around the clock, for 19 days, which is a thing that hospital tells stories about to this day. And on the 20th day, Russo Vanterpool opened his eyes. He could not speak properly. There had been a tube in his throat for almost 3 weeks, and his voice was a ruin. But he got a question out. It was not, "Where am I?" It was not, "What happened?" It was not, "Am I going to walk?" He asked who the bus driver was. That was the first thing. The very first thing. And nobody could tell him. Because his daughter called Northern Line Transit, and Northern Line Transit declined to release the name of the operator involved in the incident of March 3rd. She called again, a week later, and explained who she was, and what he had done, and why it mattered. They declined again. They cited employee privacy. Now I want you to hold that phrase in your hands for a moment, because it sounds like a small, dull, bureaucratic thing, and it is not. It is the hinge on which this entire story turns. Employee privacy. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright was not an employee. He had been fired on the 19th of March. He had been fired before the second phone call was ever made. There was no employee to protect. There was no privacy to preserve. There was a 58-year-old man sitting in a house he was about to lose, and a company that had already thrown him away. So what, exactly, was Northern Line Transit protecting? Themselves. Because think about what happens if Russo Vanterpool gets that name. He calls it, and within about 90 seconds of that phone connecting, a Hells Angels sergeant-at-arms learns that the man who kept his heart beating on the floor of a city bus for 93 minutes has been fired for doing it. Fired for cause. Stripped of 31 years. Losing his house. Northern Line's legal department had already wargamed that. It is in the record. Somebody in that department had written down, in plain language, that a wrongful termination story attached to a Hells Angels rescue was a publicity event the company could not survive. So here is the truth of it. Here is the thing that reframes everything you have watched for the last half hour. They did not fire Wendell Okonkwo-Bright despite the attention. They fired him quietly, and buried his name, and locked the door, to prevent it. The termination and the silence were not two separate decisions. They were one decision. Get rid of the man, and make sure the only person on earth who would fight for him never finds out he exists. For 4 months, that is what was happening. Somewhere in that city, a man was getting out of a hospital bed and learning to walk again on a rebuilt leg, and the single thing driving him was finding a stranger whose face he had never even seen. And on the other side of the same city, a bus company was working very hard, in offices with good carpet, to make sure he never did. They very nearly succeeded. But they made one mistake, and it was this. They forgot that there had been 41 other people on that bus, and one of them had gotten down on the floor. His name is Odell Brinkworth Moss. He is a critical care nurse. He was the man in the scrubs, 3 rows back, coming off a double shift, the man who came up that aisle and said, "I'm a nurse, move," and knelt on the other side of that body and worked for 93 minutes with a bus driver whose name he never asked for. But he had written an incident report that night for his own hospital because that is what nurses do, and he had kept a copy. Let me tell you about the man in the ditch. Russo Vanterpool, 54 years old, 22 years in the club, sergeant-at-arms of his chapter, which is not a ceremonial title. It is the man responsible for discipline, for security, for what happens when something needs to happen. And I am not going to stand here and tell you he was a good man in the way that word is usually used. I am not going to sand the edges off him so that this story goes down easier. He had a record. He had done time. The organization he gave 22 years of his life to is what it is, and it has done what it has done, and if the sight of that patch on the back of that jacket made something tighten in your chest, if some part of you understood exactly why that woman near the front of the bus stood up and said, "Put him back outside," then I want you to know that I understand that, and that I am not going to argue with you about it, and that the story does not require you to change your mind. That is the whole point. Because here is what Russo Vanterpool was doing on Route 40 on the 3rd of March. He had a daughter. She is in her 30s. She has multiple sclerosis, and it is the kind that takes things and does not give them back, and she lives alone about 4 hours west of the city, because that is where the work was when she could still work. And every Sunday, every single Sunday, in every weather short of the one that finally caught him, Russo Vanterpool rode 4 hours out to her house. He carried her groceries in from the car, because she cannot. He took her trash out to the curb, because she cannot. He changed the bulbs she could not reach, and he fixed what needed fixing, and he sat with her for an hour, and then he got back on the bike, and he rode 4 hours home. 8 hours of riding, for an hour of groceries and trash. He was on his way back from doing exactly that when the storm came down on him, and the road went out from under his front wheel, and he went 60 feet into a field, and lay face down in a snowdrift while the engine ticked itself cool. Now hold both of those things at once. That is what I am asking of you. Not one, both. Because Russo Vanterpool had spent 30 years being the man that people crossed the street to avoid. And on the 3rd of March, one man crossed the street toward him. And now I have to tell you the last thing. The thing I promised you at the very beginning of all this, when I told you that Wendell Okonkwo-Bright had a rule of his own, one he had never told anybody at Northern Line, and that in 31 years he had broken his employer's rules exactly once. Wendell had a brother. His name was Emery. He was older by 6 years. In 1987, Wendell Okonkwo-Bright's car went off a rural highway in the dark. He was not killed by the crash. He was alive on the side of that road, in the grass, where anyone driving past could have seen him. They did drive past. For 40 minutes, cars went by. He died there. Wendell was 19 years old. He was at home. And he found out the way people found out in 1987. A state trooper came up the front walk and took his hat off and stood on the porch and told a 19-year-old boy that his brother had been lying on the side of a road and that nobody had stopped. That is why he reversed the bus. That is the whole answer. There is nothing else. There is no other explanation, and there never was. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright has spent 31 years driving up and down that highway 10,000 times, in the dark, in the quiet, in the snow. And every single time he passes mile marker 62, he is 19 years old, standing in a doorway, and somebody is telling him that nobody stopped. The 8th of July was a Tuesday, and it was warm, and there was nothing in it. That is the thing about the last days of something. They are not dramatic. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright woke up that morning in a house that was no longer his in any way that mattered, because the closing was set for the 14th, 6 days out, and the paperwork was done, and the money would go to the county, and the lawyer, and the rest of it would go nowhere in particular. He had 11 boxes, 31 years of work and 26 years of marriage, and 58 years of a life, and it fit into 11 cardboard boxes, and he had counted them, because he had needed to know whether he was going to have to make 2 trips. He was working through the kitchen that morning. He had started there because he thought it would be the easiest room, and he had been wrong about that, the way people are always wrong about that. He was wrapping plates in newspaper, one at a time, slowly, because there was no reason to hurry. There was nothing waiting for him at the end of it. He had 6 days and 11 boxes, and no job and no pension, and nowhere in particular to be. The house was very quiet. It had been quiet for 4 years, but this was a different quiet. This was the quiet of a house that has already left. At 20 minutes to 9, the phone rang. It was a neighbor, a woman who had lived 4 doors down for 19 years, who had brought a casserole when Patrice died, and had never once known what to say to him afterward, and had said hello over the fence every week anyway, which is its own kind of decency. She was crying. Wendell said her name and asked her what was wrong, and she could not tell him. She tried. He said she started a sentence 3 separate times and could not finish any of them. And what came out of her, finally, in a voice he had never heard her use, was 4 words. Wendell, go outside. And then the line went dead, because she had hung up or dropped the phone or something. He stood in his kitchen with a plate in his hand and a piece of newspaper in the other, and he did not move. Because here is the truth of where that man was. On the morning of the 8th of July, he was not a man expecting good news. He had spent 4 months learning, letter by letter and door by door, that the world had made a decision about him. When a neighbor calls you crying and tells you to go outside, you do not think something wonderful is about to happen. You think about the sign in your yard. You think about the county. You think about who else could possibly be coming for a man who has nothing left. He put the plate down on the counter. He put the newspaper down beside it. And that is when he first noticed it. He said afterward that he did not hear it, not at first. That is the word he kept refusing. Here. He said you did not hear it. You felt it. Low down, underneath the floor. He said the water in the glass by the sink had a ring moving in it. Very small, very steady. He said the cupboard door that never latched properly began to tick against its frame. He said, and I am giving you his exact words, that it was the ground getting nervous. It was still far away then. It was a pressure more than a sound. Somewhere out to the east, out past the end of Marrow Street, out where the residential grid runs down to the state highway, out where Route 40 comes into town. And it was getting louder. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright walked down the hallway of a house that was not his anymore, past 11 boxes, past a wall where the pictures used to hang, and he put his hand on the front door, and he opened it. They came down Route 40, the same road, the same lanes, past the tire plant and the rail yard and the long open fields where the wind comes across with nothing in its way, past mile 61, and past mile 62, and past the fence line where a motorcycle had lain on its side in the snow with the engine ticking as it cooled. 4 months and 5 days earlier, 512 motorcycles, 14 chapters. Some of them had left the night before. Some of them had ridden 19 hours to be on that road on that morning. and had slept 4 hours in a parking lot outside the city, and had gotten up in the dark to be in position by 8. And they came into Marrow Street 2 abreast, and they kept coming, and they kept coming, and they kept coming. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright stood on his porch with his hand still on the door. You have to understand the scale of a residential street. Marrow Street is 9 blocks long. It has trees in it. It has driveways and mailboxes, and children's bicycles lying in the grass. It is a street that has never held more than 40 cars in its entire existence. 512 motorcycles filled it end to end, and had to stack up around the corner and back onto the connecting road and out toward the highway, and people who lived 6 blocks away came out onto their own porches and could see nothing but the ones in front of their own houses, and had no idea, none at all, how far back it went. The noise was not a noise, it was a physical condition. Windows were moving in their frames, car alarms went off 2 streets over. A man who lived across from Wendell said he could feel it in the roof of his mouth. And Russo Vanterpool was not at the front of it, he was third from the back. Because a man with a rod through his femur and 4 months of rehab behind him cannot hold a throttle for very long anymore, and cannot hold a bike upright at low speed the way he used to, and every single person in that formation had told him, in the way that men like that tell each other things, that he should ride in a truck. And he had said no, and then he had said it again, so they put him at the back, where a man who has to stop can stop, and they went slowly the whole way for him, and nobody said a word about it, and he rode into that street on his own 2 wheels, which was, as far as he was concerned, the entire point. And then, in front of a small white house, with a porch that needed painting, and a real estate sign in the yard, 512 engines shut off, not one after another, not in a ragged wave, at once. They had planned it. They had gone over it that morning in the parking lot the way you go over a formation, and when the front of the column came level with that mailbox, 512 people killed 512 engines inside of a second and a half. And what came down on Marrow Street then was a silence that every person who was there has struggled, ever since, to describe. They all say the same thing, in different words. They say the silence was louder. 500 people, standing in a residential street on a warm Tuesday morning in July. Nobody moving, nobody speaking, nothing but the tick of hot metal beginning to cool. That same small patient sound, 500 times over, and somewhere, absurdly, a bird. And then one man began to walk up the driveway. He was limping, badly. He would limp for the rest of his life. He came up that driveway slowly, with his weight going wrong on every other step, and 500 people watched him do it, and not one of them moved to help him, because he had told them not to. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He was holding an envelope. You already know what you think is in that envelope. Money. A check. The house saved. The sign coming out of the yard. That is the story you have been told 100 times. And it is a good story. And you have been waiting for it since the first minute of this video. So let me clear it out of the way. Because it happened. And because it is not the point. They bought the house. The taxes were paid. The lien was cleared. The sale was canceled, and the deed on the small white house on Marrow Street stayed exactly where it had been since a man and a woman sat at a kitchen table with a checkbook in 2019. That was handled by the 4th chapter down the line, and it took them about 40 minutes on a phone. That is not what was in the envelope. Inside that envelope were letters, more than 500 of them, handwritten, folded, one from every rider on that street, from men who had never met him, from women who had ridden 19 hours, from people who could not spell and did not care. Wendell read every one. It took him 3 days. That is not the twist either. Underneath the letters, in that envelope, was a certified copy of a legal filing. For 4 months, the same 4 months that Wendell Okonkwo-Bright had spent losing his health insurance, and his tax payment, and his house, and his mind, wondering every night whether he had thrown his life away for a corpse. The chapters had been pooling money, and with it, they had hired the labor attorney that Wendell could not have afforded in 10 lifetimes. And that attorney had been quietly, methodically, building a wrongful termination action against Northern Line Transit before Wendell knew any of them existed. They did not come to Marrow Street to give a man a gift. They came to give him back his job, his pension, and his name. And in the discovery for that filing, they had found something. They found an email sent by a depot supervisor named Calvin Strawbridge on the 5th of March. 8 words long, liability exposure, recommend review, and it had a timestamp on it. It was sent 11 minutes after he opened the video file, and it was sent 6 days before a single human being at Northern Line Transit asked one single question about what had actually happened on that bus. He did not pull the dispatch audio. He did not call the nurse. He did not call the hospital. He did not call the man who had worked for him for 31 years and had never been late. He watched 31 seconds of a good man on his knees. He saw an opening, and in 11 minutes he took it. And now 500 people had it in writing. Northern Line Transit settled. They did not fight it, and they did not go to arbitration, and they did not let it get anywhere near a courtroom. Wendell Okonkwo-Bright was reinstated with full back pay. The termination for cause was struck from his record. The pension, 31 years of it, was restored in full. Calvin Strawbridge resigned in October. There was no announcement. There was no statement. He cleared his desk and he took his mug with him, and the depot went on running buses. And nobody at Northern Line Transit has said his name out loud since. Calvin Strawbridge is not a monster. I want to be very clear about that, because that is exactly what makes him dangerous. He is the man who does the easy thing, the cowardly thing, the career-safe thing, and then calls it procedure. There are 100,000 of him. You have met one. And the only reason he lost is that 500 people who had no reason on this earth to care, cared anyway. So share this with one person who needs to know that the Calvins don't always win. Comment 500 if you believe that when a good man gets buried by a coward with a clipboard, somebody should come for him. And subscribe. Because I find these stories for a living, and the people who'd rather they stayed buried aren't here. You are.